Imagine being 12 years old and married to your adult cousin, not in secret, not in shame, but in a palace, with priests watching, nobles applauding, and history calling it necessary. Victoria della Rovere was born into royalty, but she never owned her own life. Before she could understand love, her body became a political weapon. Before she could say no, her bloodline was already promised. This marriage wasn't about romance, it was about power, about keeping wealth, titles, and genes locked inside one family, no matter the cost. Children would be born and die, secrets would rot behind palace doors, and one decision made for a 12-year-old girl would slowly poison an entire dynasty. This isn't ancient myth, this isn't fiction. It really happened, and the ending is darker than you think. Stay with me. Long before her name would be whispered with discomfort, before it became entangled with incest, politics, and quiet horror. Victoria della Rovere was born into a city that seemed immune to time. Urbino did not shout its importance. It did not sprawl or glitter like Florence or Rome. Instead, it endured, perched on rolling hills east of Florence, wrapped in stone walls that had watched centuries pass without flinching. To outsiders, it was little more than a provincial town. To those who understood power, Urbino was a relic of something far greater, a living monument to the Italian Renaissance. Its narrow streets curved like deliberate thoughts. Its palaces rose not to impress, but to command. And at its heart stood the ducal palace, an architectural assertion that beauty itself could be a form of authority. This was where Victoria was born on February 7, 1622, not in a cradle of innocence, but at the center of inherited ambition. The House of della Rovere had ruled Urbino for generations. They were not merely nobles, they were survivors. Rising to prominence in the 15th century, the family had mastered the most dangerous art in Italy, staying relevant through calculated marriages, shifting loyalties, and a ruthless understanding of bloodlines. They carved out dominion over duchies and principalities scattered across central Italy. Their influence reached beyond borders and into the Vatican itself. Two popes, Sixtus IV and Julius II, had emerged from della Rovere blood. Julius II, the so-called warrior pope, had commanded armies and commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Power, for this family, was not abstract. It was tangible, inherited, and expected. By the time Victoria was born, the family's glory had already begun to thin, stretched fragile by generations of intermarriage among Europe's ruling houses. Cousins married cousins. Bloodlines folded inward. What began as strategy slowly became necessity. Yet no one spoke of decay. They spoke of legacy. Victoria's father, Federico della Rovere, had only recently ascended as Duke of Urbino. He was young, barely more than a boy himself. But his position carried centuries of weight. His marriage to Claudia de' Medici was a triumph, a union between two powerful dynasties that promised security, wealth, and continuity. Claudia was no ordinary duchess. She was the daughter of Ferdinando I de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, a family whose name alone could open gates, silence enemies, and shape alliances across Europe. With this marriage, Urbino tied itself to Florence, and the della Rovere line appeared secure. Victoria was their only child, from the moment she drew breath. Her existence was political. Her name was entered into ledgers. Her future was debated in council chambers long before she could speak. Courtiers studied her as if searching for omens, a single infant upon whom the fate of a duchy might one day rest. But fate did not wait. Less than 2 years after Victoria's birth, Federico della Rovere died. He was 18, The official explanations were vague. Some claimed a sudden and violent epileptic seizure. Others whispered of poison, a convenient illness in an age where ambition traveled faster than truth. No accusation was ever proven. No culprit was named. What mattered was the absence. The Duke of Urbino was gone, and the throne stood empty. Victoria was too young to understand death, but death understood her perfectly. It reshaped her life before memory could form. Her father's face would never live in her mind, only in portraits, frozen in oil and expectation. With Federico's death, the fragile stability of Urbino fractured. A duchy without a ruler was not merely leaderless, it was vulnerable. And the most dangerous thing a child could be in 17th century Europe was an heiress. In theory, Victoria should have inherited Urbino. She was Federico's only legitimate child. By blood, the duchy was hers. In reality, blood was never enough. Lawyers argued. Clerics hesitated. Precedents were unclear. Female rule was a question Europe preferred not to answer. Some realms allowed it, others rejected it outright. In Italy, the issue was so muddled that even the most learned jurists could not agree. While men debated her fate, Victoria remained unaware, a child wrapped in silk, already standing at the edge of something vast and merciless. And Urbino, ancient and proud, waited to see whether it would survive her. In the weeks following Federico della Rovere's death, Urbino did not mourn quietly, behind closed doors. Grief gave way to calculation. Courtiers gathered in hushed corners. Letters were dispatched to Rome. Lawyers sharpened their arguments, not for justice, but for advantage. A duchy without a duke was not merely a tragedy. It was an opportunity. At the center of it all stood a child who could not yet walk. By blood, Victoria della Rovere was the rightful heir. There was no dispute on that point. Federico had left no sons, no brothers of age, no hidden claimants waiting in the wings. If inheritance were purely a matter of lineage, the matter would have been settled, but Europe had never trusted power in the hands of women, least of all in the hands of a female infant. Legal scholars combed through precedent with selective memory. Some Italian city-states had allowed female rulers in theory, others in practice. But Urbino sat in an uncomfortable gray zone. Its laws were old, contradictory, and conveniently open to interpretation. Every argument in Victoria's favor was met with another designed to delay. Dilute or deny. Delay was enough, because time was something Victoria did not possess. As uncertainty spread, one figure stepped back into the light of authority. Francesco Maria II della Rovere, Victoria's grandfather, elderly, cautious, and acutely aware that his family stood at the edge of extinction. He reclaimed the ducal title, not as a usurper, but as a caretaker. Officially, he ruled until the succession question could be resolved. Unofficially, everyone understood the truth. The clock was being allowed to run out. Francesco Maria was already old. He had no sons who could succeed him. There would be no new male heir, and with every passing year, Victoria remained too young to rule, a convenient excuse that bought time for larger forces to intervene. Those forces resided in Rome. Urbino lay on the northern edge of the Papal States, a territory the Vatican had long coveted. It was strategically valuable, culturally prestigious, and historically independent, a combination the papacy found increasingly intolerable in an era of consolidation. The question of Victoria's inheritance was placed before Pope Urban VIII to the outside world. The Pope's role was that of a neutral arbiter. In reality, he was a ruler with armies, ambitions, and a clear interest in the outcome. Urbino was not merely a duchy, it was a prize. Urban VIII's decision was cloaked in legality and concern. Victoria, he declared, was an infant, incapable of ruling for many years. The duchy, left in limbo, risked instability for the sake of order and the church. Urbino would be absorbed into the Papal States. The ruling was presented as temporary, necessary, reasonable. It was none of those things. With a single decree, the centuries-old independence of Urbino ended. Its banners were lowered, its autonomy dissolved into papal administration. What armies had failed to seize, bureaucracy accomplished quietly. Victoria, the last legitimate heir of the main della Rovere line, lost her birthright without ever being asked. When Francesco Maria II died in 1631 at the age of 82, there was no longer even the illusion of resistance. Urbino belonged to the church. The della Rovere dynasty, which had produced popes and princes, was finished. Finished, except for the child, to avoid the appearance of outright theft. Rome offered compensation. Victoria was granted the duchies of Rovere and Montefeltro, not sovereign realms, but fragmented personal holdings scattered within the larger papal domain. She would carry the title of duchess, but without real power, without a throne, without a city that answered to her name. It was a settlement designed to silence protest, not to restore justice, and yet, even stripped of her inheritance, Victoria remained dangerously valuable. Along with her titles came the art collection of the della Rovere family, one of the finest in Italy. Paintings by Titian, jewels accumulated over generations, relics of a dynasty that had once commanded the Renaissance itself. Wealth of this magnitude did not fade quietly into obscurity. It attracted attention in courts across Italy. Her name began to circulate, not as a ruler, but as a prize, a child whose marriage could transfer fortune, legitimacy, and symbolic power to whatever house claimed her. Victoria was barely old enough to speak when men began planning her future in earnest. She had lost her father, she had lost her duchy, and she was about to lose something far more personal, her childhood. Once Urbino was lost, Victoria della Rovere was quietly removed from its memory. There were no public farewells. No declarations of injustice shouted from balconies. Children displaced by power rarely are. Instead, arrangements were made with efficiency that bordered on indifference. Victoria was taken south, away from the duchy that should have been hers, and placed somewhere safe. That is, from politics, from influence, and from herself. She was sent to a convent in Grosseto, deep in Tuscan territory. The convent was not a prison, but neither was it a home. Its stone walls were clean, orderly, and mercilessly consistent. Days followed a rigid rhythm: prayer at dawn, instruction in silence, meals eaten under watchful eyes, sleep permitted only after reflection and confession. Here, Victoria learned the first lesson expected of a girl born into power. Obedience was a virtue greater than will. Her mother, Claudia de' Medici, did not remain with her, widowed young. Claudia had already begun negotiating her own future. In 1626, she remarried, this time to Leopold V, Archduke of Further Austria, a man nearly twice her age. With that marriage came a new title, a new court, and a new life in the Tyrol. Victoria was left behind. The separation was explained gently. As such, betrayals often are. Her mother had duties. God required sacrifice. This arrangement, she was told, was temporary. Temporary became permanent. Claudia departed for Austria and would go on to bear more children, building a second family far from Italy, Victoria. Meanwhile, grew up among nuns who loved her soul but had no interest in her freedom. She was educated thoroughly, though narrowly. She learned to read Latin prayers, to memorize scripture, to bow correctly, to lower her eyes when addressed. Music was permitted. Art was tolerated, so long as it served devotion. Curiosity beyond doctrine was discouraged. The nuns did not abuse her. They shaped her. Every question met with an answer about duty. Every doubt met with prayer. Every flicker of self met with correction. And hovering always at the edges of the convent's calm was the invisible presence of the Medici family. Victoria may have been secluded, but she was never forgotten. Letters arrived. Visitors came under pretense of concern. Confessors reported quietly to higher authorities. Her health, temperament, and, most importantly, her obedience were carefully monitored, because her fate had already been decided. Long before Victoria understood what marriage meant, she had been promised. Her future husband was Ferdinando II de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, her first cousin, the son of her mother's brother, Cosimo II de' Medici. Like Victoria, Ferdinando had lost his father young, like her. He had inherited a title too large for a child to control by the time Ferdinando formally ruled. Real power lay in the hands of two women, his mother, Maria Magdalena of Austria, and his grandmother, Christina of Lorraine. Together, they governed Tuscany with iron discipline and dynastic paranoia. They believed in bloodlines. They believed in consolidation. They believed that power should never leave the family. Victoria was the perfect solution. Her inheritance, her art collection, her symbolic legitimacy as the last della Rovere heir, all of it could be folded neatly into Medici hands. The fact that she was a child, and that Ferdinando was her cousin, mattered little. Such unions were not aberrations among Europe's elite. They were tradition. No one asked Victoria for consent. Why would they? In the convent, she was taught that obedience was holy, that sacrifice purified the soul, that women served God best by submission, first to the church, then to family, then to husband. Marriage, she was told, was a blessing. By the time she reached her 10th year, Victoria could kneel for hours without discomfort. She could recite prayers flawlessly. She could hide confusion behind calm. She could accept decisions without protest, exactly as intended. When word finally came that her marriage would soon be formalized, it was delivered not as news, but as destiny. God's will, her duty, and honor. Victoria listened. She nodded. She obeyed. The convent had done its work, and somewhere beyond its walls, men and women prepared to celebrate a wedding that would bind blood to blood and set in motion a tragedy generations in the making. The wedding took place in the late summer of 1634. Victoria della Rovere was 12 years old. She stood beneath vaulted ceilings carved with centuries of power, her small hands swallowed by embroidered sleeves, her body hidden beneath layers of silk meant to make her look older, or at least less like what she was, a child being handed over. The ceremony was flawless. Priests spoke of unity. Courtiers smiled. Bells rang across Florence as if announcing triumph rather than surrender. To the world, watching. This was not a scandal. It was a celebration, the perfect union of two noble bloodlines, carefully stitched together to strengthen the house of Medici. Her husband, Ferdinando II de' Medici, was 24. He was already Grand Duke of Tuscany, already a ruler, already a man shaped by court life, science, politics, and private freedoms Victoria could not imagine. He wore his authority easily, practiced in the art of appearing composed while revealing nothing. When he looked at her, there was no cruelty in his eyes. There was something worse, detachment. This marriage had not been his idea. It had been arranged years earlier by his mother, Maria Magdalena of Austria, and his grandmother, Christina of Lorraine, two women who understood dynastic survival far better than sentiment. They ruled Tuscany during Ferdinando's minority and continued to shape it even after he came of age. To them, Victoria was not a person. She was a solution. Her vast inheritance, land titles, wealth, and one of the most valuable art collections in Italy would now belong to the Medici family. The last thread of the della Rovere dynasty would be absorbed cleanly, without conflict, without war. That the bride was a child mattered less than the fact that she was available. The church raised no objection. Cousin marriages among royalty were common, even expected. The papal dispensations had been secured. God, it seemed, had already given his approval. Victoria spoke her vows softly. She had been trained for this moment, not emotionally, but spiritually. She knew what to say, how to kneel, when to bow her head. She understood that obedience was safety, that compliance was virtue. What she did not understand was what came after. When the ceremony ended, she was escorted away from the public gaze, deeper into the palace, into a world where silence mattered more than words. Servants addressed her as Grand Duchess, a title that felt unreal, almost mocking. She was given rooms of her own, spacious, richly furnished, and unmistakably separate from her husband's apartments. That separation was deliberate. Despite the marriage, Victoria remained a child. The union was not consummated, not immediately, not for years, officially. This delay was attributed to concern for her health. Unofficially, it reflected an unspoken discomfort, not with incest, but with the optics of a man bedding a girl too young to bear children safely. And yet, the expectation remained. Victoria was no longer a daughter of the convent. She was a vessel for heirs, and time would not wait forever. Life at the Tuscan court was disorienting. The convent's rigid simplicity was replaced by an environment thick with unspoken rules. Here, nothing was said directly. Glances carried meaning. Silence carried threat. Every action was observed, interpreted, and reported. Victoria moved carefully. She learned quickly that her husband lived a life separate from hers. Ferdinando was a man of intellect, fascinated by astronomy, physics, and experimentation. He patronized scholars. He protected scientists, even Galileo Galilei. When the Inquisition turned hostile, Victoria, raised in strict Catholic doctrine, found this unsettling. She believed deeply, unquestioningly, the world, as she understood it, was ordered by God and guarded by the Church. Doubt was dangerous. Curiosity was suspect. Her husband embodied both. They shared meals occasionally. They exchanged formal courtesies. But intimacy, emotional or otherwise, did not exist. They were strangers bound by contract, not companionship. Years passed, when Victoria finally began bearing children. Tragedy followed swiftly. Her first son lived only days. Another survived just long enough to be baptized before dying as well. Each death was mourned quietly, almost clinically, as if loss were expected, even accepted. The court whispered of weak blood, of generations folded too tightly inward. Finally, in 1642, a healthy boy was born, Cosimo III de' Medici. He survived. The relief was immense, a future secured, an heir delivered. Victoria devoted herself entirely to him, shaping his upbringing with relentless religious discipline. If her own life had been taken from her, she would at least control his soul. But something fundamental had already broken. The marriage that had begun as a transaction was now hollow, once the heir existed. Ferdinando's interest in the union faded entirely. His obligations, in his mind, were fulfilled. Victoria sensed it long before she understood it. The isolation returned, deeper, colder, and far more permanent than the convent had ever been. And beneath the polished surface of the Tuscan court, a truth waited to be uncovered, one that would shatter what little remained of their marriage. At the Tuscan court, time was measured not in years, but in pregnancies. Once Victoria della Rovere's body was deemed ready, her worth was recalculated. She was no longer a child bride whose marriage could be postponed. She was a Grand Duchess with a single, unforgiving duty to produce heirs. The pressure was silent but absolute. No one spoke of fear or pain. No one asked whether her body had healed from childhood. The court physicians monitored her closely. Priests offered blessings heavy with expectation, and courtiers watched her figure with disturbing attentiveness, searching for signs of swelling, of promise. When Victoria became pregnant for the first time, relief swept through Florence. At last, the union had borne fruit. The child was a boy. He was born in December 1639. He lived only a few days. The death was swift and clinical. The infant struggled, weakened almost immediately, and faded before he could be named properly. He was baptized in haste, salvation secured, and buried without ceremony. The court mourned, but briefly. Infants died often. This was not yet considered alarming. Victoria grieved in silence. She had been taught that sorrow was selfish, that suffering was God's will, that a woman's pain mattered less than her purpose, and so she prayed harder, blamed herself, and prepared her body for what everyone assumed would come next. The second pregnancy followed within a year. Hope returned. More cautious this time. The physicians assured the court that these things happened, that the next child would be stronger. Bloodlines, they insisted, were sound. The boy was born alive. He survived long enough to be baptized. Then he died as well. The pattern could no longer be ignored. Whispers returned to the corridors of power, not of grief, but of blood, of cousins marrying cousins, of dynasties folded inward until strength became fragility. Servants murmured, confessors prayed, physicians argued behind closed doors. Victoria heard none of it directly. She only saw the result: 2 empty cradles, 2 lives extinguished before memory could form. She began to understand, dimly, that her body was not failing by accident. It was doing exactly what generations of careful marriage had trained it to do: struggle. In August 1642, her 3rd son was born. This time, the child lived. He was named Cosimo, a name heavy with Medici legacy. Cosimo III de' Medici survived infancy. He grew stronger with each passing month. The court breathed again. Bells rang. Public prayers of thanksgiving were offered. Tuscany had its heir. For Victoria, the birth of Cosimo changed everything. She poured herself into him with a devotion that bordered on obsession. If she had no control over her marriage, no authority over her own fate, she would shape her son completely. He would be pure where the court was corrupt, faithful where others doubted, disciplined where indulgence ruled. Cosimo was raised under strict Roman Catholic doctrine. Priests became his constant companions. Confession, ritual, and obedience were woven into his daily life. Victoria ensured this personally, supervising tutors, dismissing those she distrusted, and isolating him from influences she deemed dangerous, including his father. Ferdinando II de' Medici was present in name, but distant in practice. He took pride in Cosimo as an heir, but not as a son, once succession was secured. His attention drifted back to his true interests: science, philosophy, and the private freedoms afforded to powerful men. The marriage between Ferdinando and Victoria existed now only on paper. They occupied separate wings of the palace. They spoke formally, sparingly. There was no warmth, no shared grief over the children they had lost. Victoria mourned alone. Ferdinando moved on. Years passed without another pregnancy, in an age where disease could erase a family overnight. This was dangerous. One heir was never enough. Dynasties survived through redundancy. 2 sons, preferably 3. The court waited, increasingly anxious. Victoria felt the waiting like a sentence. She was no longer young. The years spent pregnant, grieving, and praying had aged her beyond her time. Her health suffered. Her isolation deepened. She clung to religion not out of comfort, but necessity. And then, one night, everything shattered. It was not a rumor, not a whisper, not a suspicion. It was something she saw with her own eyes. What Victoria discovered about her husband would explain the coldness, the distance, the long years of neglect. It would also end whatever remained of their marriage. Forever. The truth did not arrive as a rumor. It did not come wrapped in whispers or hints passed between servants. It came as a moment, sudden, irreversible, and devastating in its clarity. One night, sometime after Cosimo's birth, Victoria della Rovere walked through a corridor she had no reason to be in. The palace was quiet, its vastness softened by candlelight and habit. She was not searching for answers. She was not suspicious. She was simply moving through her own home. A door stood ajar. What she saw beyond it would fracture her life into a before and an after. Inside the chamber was Ferdinando II de Medici. Not alone. The young page beside him was unmistakable. Too young to mistake for coincidence. Too close to ignore. The intimacy was unambiguous. The familiarity practiced rather than impulsive. Victoria did not scream. She did not faint. She stood frozen, absorbing a truth that rearranged every memory of her marriage: the distance, the coldness, the years of restraint disguised as propriety. None of it had been about her age. None of it had been concern for her health. She had never been the object of her husband's desire. In that instant, humiliation eclipsed shock. Not because of sin. Victoria had been raised to see sin everywhere, but because she understood what this meant within the brutal logic of court life. Her body had not been rejected because it was unready. It had been irrelevant. Ferdinando noticed her presence too late. There was no apology, no explanation, no attempt to soften the truth. He straightened, composed himself, and dismissed the page with a gesture that spoke of routine rather than panic. They did not argue. They did not speak. Words were unnecessary. The marriage, such as it was, ended in silence. From that night forward, Victoria and Ferdinando lived as strangers. They shared no intimacy. They barely shared conversation. Their contact was reduced to formal appearances and unavoidable ceremonies. Whatever fragile arrangement had existed before dissolved completely. The court knew, if not immediately, then inevitably. Nothing remained secret for long in Florence. Servants noticed the absence. Courtiers noticed the distance. Confessors noticed the bitterness in Victoria's prayers. Rumors spread, carefully worded, deliberately vague, but unmistakable in implication. Homosexuality was not spoken of openly. It was condemned publicly and tolerated privately, so long as it did not threaten succession. Ferdinando's duty, in the eyes of the court, had already been fulfilled. An heir existed. Victoria understood this more clearly than anyone. Once Cosimo was born, she had ceased to be necessary. Her husband's life continued, intellectually vibrant, socially admired, politically competent. He founded scientific academies. He surrounded himself with thinkers, artists, and protégés. He cultivated an image of enlightened rulership that contrasted sharply with his wife's rigid piety. Victoria withdrew. She retreated into religion with a fervor sharpened by betrayal. Faith became armor. Discipline became refuge. Where her husband embraced inquiry, she embraced certainty. Galileo Galilei, whom Ferdinando protected from the Inquisition, represented everything Victoria feared. Doubt elevated to virtue, to her. Science untethered from doctrine was not progress, it was heresy. The divide between them was no longer merely personal, it was ideological. Years passed in cold coexistence. Then, in 1659, something shifted, whether driven by political necessity, pressure from advisors, or the simple realization that one heir was not enough. Ferdinando and Victoria were pushed toward an uneasy reconciliation. It was not tender. It was not honest. It was functional. They spoke again. They shared space again. They fulfilled, once more, the obligations of marriage. 9 months later, in November 1660, Victoria gave birth to a second surviving son, Francesco Maria de' Medici. The gap between brothers was 18 years. The birth was less celebrated than Cosimo's. But its significance was undeniable. A second heir secured the dynasty further. Redundancy, the lifeline of royal survival, had been restored for Victoria. The child was both consolation and confirmation. Proof that her body had never been the problem. Proof that her marriage had never been real. After Francesco's birth, the reconciliation ended as abruptly as it had begun. Ferdinando returned to his separate life. Victoria returned to hers. There would be no third chance. The marriage was now an arrangement in name only, yet in the peculiar arithmetic of power. Victoria's influence was growing. Her husband still ruled, but her son Cosimo was maturing, and he adored her. She had shaped his worldview carefully, deliberately, ensuring that loyalty to mother outweighed affection for father, and that loyalty would matter, because the Medici court was drifting toward scandal, unrest, and moral decay. And when Ferdinando finally died, it would be Victoria, not his memory, who would guide the future of Tuscany. The child bride had survived, and she was no longer powerless. The marriage of Cosimo III de' Medici was meant to be a triumph. On paper, it was flawless. In 1661, Cosimo wed Marguerite Louise d'Orléans, a French princess of the House of Orléans, first cousin to King Louis XIV of France. The alliance tied Tuscany to the most powerful monarchy in Europe. Diplomats applauded. Ministers congratulated themselves. Victoria della Rovere, watching from behind the ceremony, believed she had secured the future. She was wrong. From the beginning, the marriage was hostile. Marguerite Louise had not wanted Tuscany. She had not wanted Florence. She had not wanted Cosimo, raised in the glittering, permissive court of France. She found the Tuscan court suffocating, narrow, moralistic, and obsessively religious. Worst of all, she found her mother-in-law intolerable. Victoria embodied everything Marguerite despised: severity, control, judgment. Where Marguerite laughed loudly and lived freely, Victoria watched silently and remembered everything. The clash was immediate, instinctive, and irreversible. Cosimo stood between them and failed. He adored his wife, at least initially, but he feared his mother. When conflict arose, he retreated inward. seeking refuge in prayer and obedience rather than confrontation, and when forced to choose, he chose Victoria. Always. The marriage deteriorated rapidly. Marguerite mocked Cosimo openly. She humiliated him in public gatherings. She refused intimacy, ridiculed his piety, and surrounded herself with favorites who shared her contempt for Tuscan restraint. Rumors exploded across Florence. It was said they consummated the marriage only once. It was said Marguerite despised her husband physically. It was said she laughed at his devotions behind closed doors. And yet, children were born, 3 of them. First, Ferdinando de' Medici, the long-awaited heir. Then Anna Maria Luisa, a daughter. Finally, Gian Gastone, a second son. The births should have stabilized the marriage. They did the opposite. Marguerite grew increasingly volatile. She drank heavily. She lashed out at servants. She struck Cosimo during arguments. She attempted to steal and sell Tuscan crown jewels. Planning to fund an escape from Florence, Victoria was no longer merely an observer. She intervened openly. She scolded her daughter-in-law in court assemblies. She undermined her authority in front of ministers. She encouraged Cosimo to assert himself, not as a husband seeking harmony, but as a ruler defending order. The court became a battleground. One contemporary wrote bitterly, "The Pitti Palace has become the devil's own abode, from morning until midnight. Nothing is heard but shouting, insults, and endless quarrels." Florence watched in fascination and horror. Cosimo sided with his mother at every turn. Each act of loyalty deepened Marguerite's rage. Each public humiliation pushed her closer to breaking. In 1675, Marguerite Louise reached her limit, just weeks before her 30th birthday. She fled Tuscany. She left behind her husband. She left behind her children. Ferdinando, 11. Anna Maria Luisa, 7. And Gian Gastone, 4. She returned to France in disgrace, effectively abandoning her role as Grand Duchess. She would never return, officially. The separation was framed as a necessity for peace. Privately, everyone understood it as defeat. Marguerite had lost, not to her husband, but to his mother. Victoria had won, with Marguerite gone. Victoria stepped fully into the vacuum. She assumed responsibility for raising her grandchildren, shaping their education as she had shaped Cosimo's. Priests replaced tutors. Confession replaced curiosity. Discipline replaced affection. The children bore the quiet marks of generations of careful marriage, delicate health, unstable temperaments, peculiar sensitivities. Victoria noticed. She said nothing. To acknowledge weakness was to invite fear. She doubled down. Faith would correct what blood had broken. Yet even Victoria could not control everything. Her granddaughter, Anna Maria Luisa, raised in rigid Catholicism, would one day marry a Protestant prince of the Palatinate, a union that mocked Victoria's lifelong devotion to doctrinal purity. Her grandson, Gian Gastone, neglected, resentful, and increasingly bitter, would grow into a man whose behavior shocked even the morally exhausted Florentine court. The dynasty had been preserved, but distorted. Victoria had protected the Medici line with ferocity, but in doing so, she had shaped a future riddled with instability, repression, and quiet despair. And still, she remained at the center of power, even as Cosimo entered his 40s. His mother continued to sit in councils, influence appointments, and steer policy. Ministers tolerated her presence with clenched teeth, waiting for the day her grip would finally loosen. That day would come, slowly, reluctantly, as age, religion, and exhaustion began to claim her. But by then, the damage was done. The House of Medici still stood. yet it stood on foundations already cracking. By the late 1680s, the court of Tuscany had grown tired, not tired of ceremony, that endured as it always had, but tired of tension, of rigid morality, of a ruler who governed as if salvation were a matter of law. Cosimo III de' Medici was no longer young, nor was his mother, Victoria della Rovere. Once a child bride, once a discarded duchess, once the silent center of power, had entered the final phase of her life. Age softened her movements but not her convictions. If anything, time sharpened them. Yet even she could feel the shift. Her health declined. Her body, long disciplined by pregnancy, fasting, and ritual, grew heavier, slower. She became increasingly devout, visiting convents across Florence and the Tuscan countryside, funding chapels, endowing religious houses, and surrounding herself with confessors and clerics who affirmed her vision of order, power, for Victoria, had always been inseparable from faith. But the court was changing. Ministers, particularly those responsible for trade, diplomacy, and finance, began pushing gently, then more firmly. For distance, they respected the Dowager Grand Duchess, but they feared the consequences of her continued influence. Tuscany had stagnated. Its economy lagged. Its reputation had darkened. Foreign observers described Florence no longer as a beacon of Renaissance brilliance, but as a city trapped in ritual, suspicion, and moral exhaustion. Cosimo listened, but hesitated. He had never learned to rule without his mother. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Victoria withdrew from daily governance. Not because she wished to, but because even she recognized that her presence had become a liability. By the end of the decade, she no longer attended every council. Decisions reached her indirectly. Her approval, once immediate and assumed, became occasional. The matriarch was loosening her grip. She focused instead on securing the futures of those she loved most, particularly her younger son, Francesco Maria de' Medici. Born of a reconciliation that never truly healed, had lived largely in his brother's shadow. Victoria ensured he would not be left vulnerable. She maneuvered him into positions of dignity and safety, appointing him governor of Siena, a crucial Tuscan city. Later, she arranged for him to become a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church. It was a familiar strategy. The church had always been the refuge of surplus sons, the vault where dynasties stored their excess blood. Francesco would never rule Tuscany. But as a cardinal, he would wield influence, protection, and prestige. Victoria had learned long ago how to survive by proximity to power. Her grandchildren, too, occupied her thoughts. Anna Maria Luisa, intelligent and composed, married Johann Wilhelm, Elector Palatine, a Protestant ruler of a German principality. The union troubled Victoria deeply. A Catholic granddaughter bound to a Protestant court felt like a personal failure, a crack in the religious edifice she had built so carefully. Yet she sanctioned the marriage, perhaps, at last. Pragmatism outweighed dogma. Gian Gaston, by contrast, worried her endlessly. He was crude, erratic, and deeply unhappy. A boy who had grown into a man without direction or affection. His behavior embarrassed the court, alarmed the clergy, and foreshadowed instability. Victoria prayed harder. She always prayed harder. By the time she reached her 70s, she spent much of her year in Pisa, preferring its milder winters and quieter atmosphere to Florence's oppressive politics. There, in the ducal palace overlooking the Arno, she reflected on a life shaped entirely by forces she had never chosen and power she had seized anyway. On March 5, 1694, or possibly the 6th, accounts differ, Victoria della Rovere died. She was 72 years old. Her body, by then heavy and worn, was laid to rest in the Basilica of San Lorenzo in Florence. Among the Medici dead, The duchies of Rovere and Montefeltro passed to her son Francesco. Her vast art collection, including the priceless works by Titian, was absorbed fully into the Medici holdings. In death, as in life, her legacy became someone else's possession. At the time of her passing, Victoria believed she had succeeded. The dynasty still ruled. 2 grandsons stood in line of succession. The Medici name endured. She did not live to see how wrong she was. Within decades, her eldest grandson Ferdinando would die childless. Cosimo III would pass away in 1723, leaving the throne to Gian Gastone, the very grandson whose instability had haunted her final years. And in 1737, with Gian Gastone's death, the House of Medici would end. No heirs, no continuation, no salvation through blood. The dynasty Victoria had spent her entire life protecting collapsed completely, not despite her efforts, but perhaps because of them. She had preserved power. She had enforced obedience. She had kept bloodlines closed and pure, and in doing so, she helped suffocate the very future she fought to secure. The child bride became a matriarch. The matriarch became a warning, and history, as it often does, remembered her not for what she endured, but for what did not survive her. Victoria della Rovere did not live to see the end. That, perhaps, was her final mercy. When she died in 1694, Florence still stood beneath the Medici banner. The palaces were intact. The court still functioned. On the surface, the dynasty appeared secure, even permanent. History, however, had already made its decision. Her eldest grandson, Ferdinando de' Medici, was everything Tuscany needed and everything it would lose. Intelligent, charismatic, musically gifted, and outwardly healthy. He was groomed carefully as the future Grand Duke. The court invested its remaining hope in him, but hope had become a habit, not a guarantee. Ferdinando married. As tradition demanded, the match was appropriate. The bloodlines were acceptable. The rituals were observed. Yet the marriage produced no children. Years passed. Physicians were summoned. Prayers were offered. Excuses multiplied. The same unspoken fear that had haunted Victoria's life returned with cruel familiarity. The blood was failing again. In 1713, Ferdinando died. He was only 50. He died before his father, Cosimo III, extinguishing the dynasty's most viable future. Florence mourned openly this time, not merely for the man, but for what his death represented. A line breaking. Cosimo III ruled on, increasingly isolated, increasingly consumed by religion and regret. His court had grown quiet, brittle, and deeply conservative. Foreign powers no longer feared Tuscany. They pitied it, or ignored it. When Cosimo died in 1723, the throne passed to his youngest son, Gian Gastone de' Medici. It was the outcome Victoria had always feared. Gian Gastone had grown into a ruler in name only, bitter, erratic, and openly disdainful of court life. He withdrew almost entirely from governance. He surrounded himself with favorites, indulged in scandalous behavior, and allowed the machinery of state to rust. The court decayed visibly. Florence became a place of whispers and neglect. Administration faltered. Nobles maneuvered not for influence, but for survival. Tuscany existed now less as a sovereign power than as a question awaiting an answer. That answer came from outside. Europe had changed. Dynasties rose and fell not through marriage alone, but through treaties, wars, and diplomatic convenience. The extinction of the Medici male line was no longer a private tragedy. It was a geopolitical opportunity. Gian Gastone had no heirs. He would never produce one. When he died in 1737, the House of Medici, one of the most influential dynasties in European history, ended completely. No sons, no continuation, no blood left to claim the name. Tuscany passed into foreign hands. Its fate decided by powers that had once courted Medici favor. The palaces remained, the art endured. The name survived only in memory. Ironically, it was Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, Victoria's granddaughter, who ensured that Florence itself would not be stripped bare. Childless and widowed, she negotiated the family pact, securing the Medici art collections for the city in perpetuity. The treasures Victoria had once inherited, guarded, and passed on would become public legacy, no longer symbols of dynastic power, but of cultural survival. In that, at least, something endured. Victoria della Rovere's life had been shaped by forces she did not choose: child marriage, dynastic obsession, religious absolutism, and the brutal arithmetic of bloodlines. She survived by mastering those forces, by enforcing obedience where she had been denied choice, by preserving power where she had been dispossessed. She believed control could conquer fragility. History proved otherwise. The Medici dynasty did not collapse because Victoria failed. It collapsed because no one could outrun the cost of generations lived for power instead of people. Her story is not merely a tragedy of incest or monarchy. It is a warning, a reminder that when human lives are treated as vessels, for blood, for legacy, for ambition, the future may arrive intact, but it will arrive empty. Florence still stands. That is the cruel irony. Centuries after the Medici vanished, the city remains drenched in their legacy. Visitors walk beneath domes they funded, through galleries they filled, across bridges their money built. The stones are beautiful, the names are celebrated. The cost is invisible. No plaque marks the lives narrowed into duty. No statue honors the children born only to die. The marriages engineered without consent. The women reduced to vessels for continuity. History preserves the triumphs and erases the transactions. Victoria della Rovere exists today mostly as a footnote, a duchess by marriage, a dowager by longevity, a mother to a failed succession. Her name is spoken softly, if at all, when it appears. It is often reduced to scandal, a child bride, an incestuous union, a rigidly pious matriarch. That reduction is convenient. It allows history to avoid the harder truth. Victoria was not an anomaly. She was a product of a system that treated blood as currency, faith as control, and women as infrastructure. Her life was designed long before she could speak, and every attempt she made to seize agency was constrained by the same machinery that had consumed her childhood. She learned obedience because disobedience was impossible. She learned control because vulnerability was punished. She learned power because power was the only language her world respected. And yet, power did not save what she loved. The Medici did not fall because they were careless. They fell because they were meticulous. They curated bloodlines. They sealed alliances inward. They believed purity ensured survival. What they created instead was fragility. A lineage so tightly controlled it could not adapt. A court so morally rigid it could not breathe. A future so planned it had no room for life. Victoria believed faith could compensate for biology, that discipline could override inheritance, that obedience could purify decay. History answered her with silence. When the Medici line ended in 1737, Europe barely paused. Power moved on. Treaties were signed. New rulers took possession of Tuscany without ceremony. The world did not mourn dynasties. It replaced them. What endured were the objects, paintings, palaces, names carved into stone. The people vanished, and that is the final lesson of Victoria della Rovere. She was born into a system that demanded everything from her and promised permanence in return. She gave it her childhood, her body, her marriage, her sons, her faith, her will. In the end, the system collapsed anyway, not because she failed, but because no system built on the denial of human choice can sustain itself forever. When modern audiences recoil at her story, the discomfort does not come from its age, it comes from its familiarity. The logic is not medieval, it is timeless. Whenever power treats people as means instead of lives, it creates legacies that look strong until they suddenly aren't. Florence still stands, the Medici name still echoes, but Victoria della Rovere's world is gone. And that, perhaps, is the quiet justice history allows after the Medici were gone. Tuscany did not collapse, it adjusted. That, too, was part of the tragedy. Foreign rulers stepped into Florence with polite efficiency. Titles were reassigned, administrations were restructured. The machinery of power continued to turn, indifferent to the blood that had once fueled it. No one demanded a reckoning for the lives spent maintaining a dynasty that could not save itself. History moved forward without apology. And yet, beneath the calm transition lay a profound absence. Not of rulers, but of meaning. The Medici had ruled Tuscany for nearly 3 centuries. They had shaped art, finance, religion, and identity itself. Their disappearance should have left a void so large it echoed across Europe. Instead, it barely registered. That was the final proof of failure. Dynasties justify their excesses by promising permanence. They demand sacrifice in exchange for continuity. They insist that suffering today will secure tomorrow. The Medici demanded everything. They delivered nothing lasting in return. Victoria della Rovere's life, when viewed from a distance, reads like a series of rational decisions. Each step, her marriage, her obedience, her discipline, her control over her son, made sense within the logic of survival. None of it was irrational. None of it was cruel by the standards of her world. And yet, the outcome was ruin. Not dramatic ruin, not violent ruin, but the quiet, irreversible ruin of extinction. This is the kind history rarely dramatizes because it offers no spectacle, no battlefield, no execution, no single villain to condemn. Just the slow suffocation of possibility under the weight of tradition. Victoria did what she was taught to do. She preserved bloodlines. She enforced faith. She protected power. And in doing so, she helped perfect a system that could no longer produce life. Her grandchildren embodied the consequence. One died childless. One ruled without purpose. One preserved art because there was no blood left to preserve. The future of Tuscany passed not to descendants, but to custodians. That distinction matters. Blood promises ownership. Custodianship admits loss, in modern terms. Victoria's story unsettles because it exposes a truth we prefer to keep buried. Systems that prioritize legacy over humanity do not fail loudly. They fail quietly, often with applause still ringing in their ears. The wedding of a 12-year-old girl to her adult cousin did not end the Medici dynasty. It merely revealed what had already begun. By the time the last Medici died, the dynasty was already hollow, preserved in form, emptied of resilience. What remained was ceremony without vitality, power without adaptability, faith without compassion. Victoria believed obedience was salvation. History answered with erasure. Today, tourists walk through Florence unaware that the city is not a monument to success, but to survival after collapse. The art endures because it was freed from blood. The buildings stand because they outlived ownership. And Victoria della Rovere, the child bride, the mother, the matriarch, remains suspended between condemnation and pity. She was neither hero nor villain. She was a human being trapped inside a machine that required her to stop being one. That is why her story endures. Not because it is shocking, not because it is scandalous, but because it is familiar. Whenever power demands sacrifice without consent, whenever tradition excuses harm as necessity, whenever legacy is valued above life, Victoria's story repeats itself, quietly, efficiently, and without mercy. The Medici are gone. The system that shaped them is not. And that is the final, uncomfortable truth this story leaves behind. It is tempting to tell ourselves this story belongs to another world. A world of palaces and priests, of arranged marriages and absolute power, of people who lived so long ago that their suffering feels theoretical. But that comfort dissolves quickly, because at its core, Victoria della Rovere's story is not about Italy. It is not about royalty. It is not even about incest or dynasties. It is about what happens when systems matter more than people. Victoria was 12 years old when her life ended, even though her body lived another 60 years. Everything after the wedding was survival, adaptation, and compensation. She learned to become hard because softness had no value. She learned to control because she had never been allowed to choose. Her obedience was not virtue, it was conditioning. Her faith was not peace, it was armor. Her power was not freedom. It was the shape captivity takes when escape is impossible. Modern audiences recoil at her marriage because it violates moral lines we believe are immovable. But history is rarely built by villains who think they are cruel. It is built by people who believe they are necessary. Necessary marriages, necessary sacrifices, necessary suffering. Every generation that justified what happened to Victoria believed it was protecting something larger than her. A dynasty, a faith, a future. And every one of them was wrong. The Medici did not survive because of her obedience. They did not endure because of her control. They did not thrive because of her sacrifice. They ended anyway. That is the part history rarely emphasizes. Compliance does not guarantee survival. It only guarantees participation. Victoria complied perfectly. She still lost everything. When American audiences hear this story, the unease comes not from its age, but from its familiarity. The language has changed. The costumes are different. The justifications are more sophisticated. But the logic remains. Whenever institutions demand silence in exchange for belonging, whenever tradition excuses harm as continuity, whenever power claims that sacrifice today will secure tomorrow, someone like Victoria is being created. She may not wear a crown. She may not live in a palace, but she will be told that her suffering is meaningful, that her pain serves a purpose. That resistance would be selfish, and history will move on without her. That is why this story matters. Not because it is shocking, not because it is tragic, but because it refuses to stay in the past. Victoria della Rovere did not destroy the Medici dynasty. She revealed its weakness. A system that requires children to secure its future has no future. A legacy built on obedience cannot adapt. A bloodline preserved at all costs will eventually run out of life. The Medici left behind masterpieces, architecture, and names etched into history. They did not leave behind continuity. Victoria left behind no manifesto, no rebellion, no escape. Only a life that proves a quiet truth we still struggle to accept. Survival is not the same as victory, and sometimes the most devastating stories are not about what happened, but about what was normalized long enough for everyone to stop questioning it. There is a moment, somewhere near the end of this story, when discomfort replaces curiosity. The facts are already known. The dynasty has already fallen. The child bride has already grown old and died. And yet, something lingers. That lingering unease is not about what happened to Victoria della Rovere. It is about how easily everyone around her accepted it, and how efficiently the system continued afterward. No single person destroyed her life. That is the most unsettling part. Her marriage was arranged by women who believed they were protecting their family. Her obedience was praised by clergy who believed they were saving her soul. Her suffering was normalized by a court that believed it was preserving stability. At no point did the system pause and say, "This is wrong," because systems do not possess conscience, they only possess momentum. Victoria learned early that resistance would achieve nothing. There was no door to walk out of, no alternative life waiting beyond the walls. The convent taught her submission not through cruelty, but through inevitability. By the time she reached adulthood, obedience felt less like surrender and more like physics, the natural order of things. This is how power truly sustains itself, not through force alone, but through internalization. Victoria did not spend her life screaming. She spent it adjusting. She learned which parts of herself were dangerous and buried them. She learned which behaviors were rewarded and perfected them. She learned that survival meant alignment, and in doing so, she became exactly what her world needed her to be: a compliant bride, a disciplined mother, a pious matriarch, never a free person. Modern audiences often search for rebellion in historical figures like Victoria. They want defiance, escape, confrontation, something that reassures us we would have acted differently. But that is a luxury of distance. The truth is harder. Most people in her position would have done exactly what she did, not because they are weak, but because the cost of resistance was total erasure. We like stories where oppression is obvious and villains are clear. Victoria's story offers neither. The people who shaped her fate believed themselves righteous. The rituals were beautiful. The language was moral. The violence was administrative. This is why the story feels modern. Because the most dangerous systems are not sustained by monsters. They are sustained by people doing their jobs, honoring tradition, and believing that sacrifice is noble when it belongs to someone else. Victoria's later life tempts us to reinterpret her as powerful. She advised rulers, she shaped policy, she controlled access, she won battles within the court. But power gained inside a cage is still defined by the cage. She could influence outcomes, but not question premises. She could enforce order, but not imagine freedom. She could preserve a dynasty, but not redesign the system that consumed it. In the end, she became both victim and instrument. That duality is uncomfortable and essential, because it reveals a truth we resist. People can perpetuate harm even while acting from survival. Fear and belief. Systems train their subjects not only to obey, but to replicate. Victoria did not invent dynastic cruelty. She inherited it. She maintained it. She passed it on. And then it collapsed anyway. What remains is the mirror this story holds up to us. When we hear that a 12-year-old girl was married off for political advantage and feel horror, the question is not why they did this. The question is, what do we still justify today because it is structured, normalized, and profitable? Which sacrifices are still framed as necessary? Whose autonomy is still negotiated without consent? Which harms persist because they are tradition, policy, or how things work? Victoria's story endures because it refuses to reassure us. There is no redemption arc, no moral triumph, no lesson neatly learned by history. There is only a system that consumed a child, produced a matriarch, and ended in silence. And there is us, listening, unsettled, recognizing that the distance between then and now is thinner than we want to believe. That is why this story stays with you. Not because it is old, but because it is unfinished. Not every story survives because it is preserved. Some survive because they refuse to disappear. Victoria della Rovere's life was never meant to be remembered. Dynasties do not archive their own compromises. They record victories. Patronage, architecture, lineage, the quiet mechanisms that make those achievements possible, the marriages, the bodies, the obedience, are meant to dissolve into normalcy. And yet, her story resurfaces. It returns not as celebration, but as disturbance. Historians encounter her as a problem to be explained. Writers circle her as a symbol. Audiences stumble into her life and leave unsettled, unsure why this particular woman lingers when so many others vanished without trace. The answer is not uniqueness, it is clarity. Victoria's life exposes the transaction cleanly. Nothing is hidden. A child is married. Power is preserved. A dynasty weakens. It ends. The arc is simple enough to resist rationalization, yet complex enough to resist dismissal. That balance gives the story weight. When narratives endure across centuries, it is rarely because they are extraordinary. It is because they map a pattern people recognize but struggle to name. Victoria's story is not remembered because she was a duchess. It is remembered because she was useful. Useful to a system, useful to a family, useful to a future that never arrived. In modern culture, we often mistake endurance for success. If something lasts long enough, we assume it worked. The Medici lasted nearly 300 years. Their art reshaped Europe. Their name became synonymous with power. But endurance is not proof of health. It is often proof of extraction. Victoria's life demonstrates how systems persist by converting people into components. Once converted, those people no longer register as losses. They become inputs, acceptable costs, necessary sacrifices. This is why her story resonates in societies far removed from monarchy. Because the structure is familiar. Replace dynasty with institution. Replace bloodline with brand. Replace marriage with contract. The logic remains intact. Individuals are asked to surrender autonomy for continuity. Dissent is framed as betrayal. Compliance is rewarded with proximity to power. And when the system finally collapses, as all closed systems do, responsibility dissolves into history. No one is blamed. Victoria's story resists that erasure by refusing to offer villains. There is no single hand to point at, no singular moment where everything goes wrong. The damage is cumulative, polite, justified at every step. That makes it harder to process and harder to forget. In the United States, audiences often approach historical stories searching for agency. What could she have done? Where was the turning point? But Victoria's life offers no satisfying counterfactual. There was no safe rebellion, no viable exit, no version of her choices that would have produced a different outcome without altering the entire structure around her. This absence unsettles deeply. It challenges the belief that morality always has a visible path, that courage always has an effect, that injustice can always be confronted directly. Victoria's world did not reward confrontation. It absorbed it. So her story persists not as inspiration, but as indictment, an indictment of systems that survive by narrowing the range of acceptable lives, an indictment of traditions that mistake repetition for legitimacy, an indictment of power that demands loyalty without accountability. The Medici name endures on museum walls and guidebooks. Victoria's name endures in footnotes, margins, and uneasy conversations, where stories are not polished, but questioned, and perhaps that is the only form of justice history offers. Not restoration, not redemption, but resonance, a life that continues to trouble the present, a narrative that interrupts admiration with doubt, a reminder that what we choose to preserve often says less about greatness and more about what we are willing to overlook. Victoria della Rovere did not leave behind a movement. She left behind a pattern. And patterns, once seen, are difficult to unsee. That is why this story survives. Not because it is complete, but because it keeps asking something uncomfortable of anyone who hears it. What are we sustaining right now, and who is paying for it quietly? Every story ends somewhere. Not where the last person dies, not where the dynasty collapses, but where the listener finally understands what the story has been asking all along. Victoria della Rovere's life does not end with revelation. There is no final confession, no moment of clarity where the world admits its mistake. She dies as she lived, within the rules, surrounded by ritual, absorbed into history without apology. Her death changes nothing, and that is precisely the point. The Medici dynasty ended not with outrage, but with procedure. Papers were signed, titles reassigned, the future redistributed. The world did not stop to mourn the cost of what had sustained 3 centuries of power. History rarely does. What it remembers instead are outcomes, not inputs, results, not sacrifices, palaces, not the lives narrowed to maintain them. Victoria's childhood disappears into statistics. Her marriage becomes a footnote. Her suffering is explained away as normal for the time. But normal does not mean harmless. And tradition does not mean inevitable. The story closes not because it resolves, but because it reaches its most uncomfortable truth. Nothing in this narrative went wrong in the way we expect tragedies to go wrong. There was no sudden collapse, no dramatic revolt, no single mistake. Only consistency. Consistency in obedience. Consistency in justification. Consistency in placing legacy above life. That consistency was lethal. When the Medici line finally extinguished itself, it proved something dynasties never intend to demonstrate, that human lives spent preserving systems do not guarantee those systems will survive. Victoria gave everything she was asked to give: her childhood, her body, her sons, her will. The system still failed. This is why the story ends here, not with her, but with us, because the question it leaves behind is not historical. It is personal. What would you have done? Not as a modern observer with distance and vocabulary, but as a child raised without alternatives, as a woman taught that obedience was morality, as a person whose survival depended on alignment. Most people do not live in palaces. Most people do not belong to dynasties. But many live inside systems that reward silence, normalize sacrifice, and promise meaning in exchange for compliance. That is the inheritance Victoria leaves behind. Not blood, not art, not power. A warning that systems do not need cruelty to destroy lives. Only structure. That injustice does not require villains. Only normalization. That survival inside a system is not proof the system deserves to survive. The Medici believed they were eternal. They are not. Victoria believed obedience would protect the future. It did not. What remains are stones, paintings, and stories, and a choice each generation faces quietly: to preserve what exists at any cost, or to question whether what exists deserves preservation at all. Florence still stands, but the world that demanded a child bride to secure its future does not. And if this story has done its work, neither will the belief that power justifies everything it consumes. That is where it ends, not with history, but with awareness. After the story ends, there is usually silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that invites forgetting. This is where most histories stop. The dynasty has fallen. The figures have died. The lesson has been implied. The audience is expected to move on, reassured that the past is sealed off from the present. But some stories resist that closure. Victoria della Rovere's life leaves behind a question that history textbooks are not designed to answer. Who paid for what endured? The Medici are remembered for patronage, innovation, and vision. Their collapse is framed as political inevitability, demographic accident, or biological misfortune. The human cost that sustained them for centuries remains abstract, too diffuse to blame, too normalized to mourn. Victoria's story breaks that abstraction, because when a system requires a child to sacrifice her future in order to preserve its own, the cost is no longer theoretical. It becomes personal, intimate, unavoidable, and once seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. History often reassures us that the past was cruel because it was ignorant, that progress is what separates us from it. But Victoria's world was not ignorant of harm. It simply ranked it. Her suffering was not denied. It was justified. That distinction matters. Justification is far more dangerous than denial. It allows systems to continue without guilt. It teaches participants to believe they are acting responsibly, even virtuously. While perpetuating harm, Victoria was praised for obedience, commended for endurance, remembered, when remembered at all, as devout and proper. These are not neutral descriptors. They are reward systems given to those who do not disrupt them. And this is where the story reaches beyond history, because every era develops its own vocabulary for compliance, its own language of necessity, its own rituals that transform coercion into tradition. When listeners feel unsettled at the end of this story, it is not because they fear the past. It is because they recognize the structure. The details change, the logic does not. Institutions still frame sacrifice as opportunity. Systems still reward silence with belonging. Power still insists that survival requires alignment. Victoria della Rovere's life is not exceptional because it was tragic. It is exceptional because it was ordinary within its system and catastrophic in its outcome. That is why her story lingers after the facts are finished. Not to accuse individuals, not to demand retroactive justice, but to sharpen perception, so that when modern systems speak the language of necessity, we hear the echo. So that when harm is normalized through ritual, we recognize the pattern. So that when legacy is valued above life, we pause. The Medici believed they were building eternity. They built memory instead. And memory, unlike power, does not obey. It surfaces when least convenient. It disrupts admiration. It forces questions where comfort once lived. This story does not ask you to judge the past. It asks you to notice the present, because the most dangerous systems are not the ones history condemns, but the ones it praises while quietly erasing the people who made them possible. That is what remains after the blood is gone, after the titles dissolve, after the palaces become museums, a story that refuses to close cleanly, and a listener who cannot quite return to silence. Long after the voices fall silent, echoes remain. They don't repeat the words exactly. They distort them. They adapt them to new rooms, new ears, new assumptions. Victoria della Rovere's story echoes because the structures that shaped it never truly vanished. They evolved. They learned new languages. They traded crowns for contracts, bloodlines for brands, sanctuaries for systems that appear neutral and rational. But the exchange rate stayed the same. Human cost. Quietly converted into continuity. In the present, we rarely speak of sacrifice in such explicit terms. We call it opportunity, duty, resilience, the price of success. We celebrate endurance without asking who was forced to endure. We admire outcomes without tracing the inputs back to the people who paid them. This is how echoes work. They don't announce themselves as repetitions. They arrive disguised as progress. When audiences in the United States encounter Victoria's story, they often feel a specific kind of discomfort, not outrage, but recognition. The narrative doesn't accuse, it refrains. It simply places a mirror where certainty used to be. Because the unsettling question is not whether we would allow this now, it's whether we already do, under different names. Victoria's childhood was surrendered to preserve a future promised by authority. Today, futures are still promised by institutions that ask for early compliance, delayed autonomy, and unquestioned alignment. The details differ. The age thresholds shift. The contracts look voluntary. The pressure does not. The echo persists whenever someone is told that resistance would be irresponsible, that questioning would endanger stability, that opting out would betray something larger than themselves. Victoria did not choose her marriage. Many today do not choose the structures that shape their lives. They inherit them, adapt to them, and learn to survive inside them. History becomes dangerous when it reassures us that such patterns are over. Victoria's story refuses that reassurance. It shows us how harm can be ceremonial, polite, even celebrated, even how communities can participate in damage without malice, simply by believing they are preserving something valuable. The Medici believed art justified sacrifice. Modern systems believe efficiency does. The logic remains intact. When we ask why this story continues to be told, the answer is not curiosity about the past. It is anxiety about the present. The story acts as a diagnostic tool, revealing what we excuse, what we normalize, what we reward. It also exposes a quiet bias in how we remember. We remember builders. We remember patrons. We remember winners. We rarely remember the lives narrowed so that others could be remembered at all. Victoria's name returns not because she triumphed, but because she clarifies the cost. Her life draws a clean line between preservation and depletion, between what survives and what is consumed so that survival appears possible. This is why her story keeps resurfacing in new forms: essays, documentaries, lectures, conversations that begin with shock and end with silence. Each retelling strips away a little more romanticism and leaves behind a question no era answers comfortably. What are we willing to lose to keep what we have? The echo does not demand guilt. It demands awareness. Because awareness is the only thing systems cannot easily absorb. Victoria lived in a world where awareness changed nothing. She could see the structure, understand its logic, and still have no exit. That reality should not reassure us. It should alarm us. It means recognizing a pattern is not enough. What matters is whether recognition leads to refusal. The Medici story ended because the system consumed its own future. Modern systems rarely collapse so visibly. They persist by distributing harm thinly, quietly, and efficiently, which makes the echoes harder to trace and more important to hear. If this story lingers, it is not asking us to condemn the past. It is asking us to interrupt the present, to notice when sacrifice is framed as necessity, to question when endurance is praised without consent, to remember that survival achieved through depletion is not success, it is delay. Victoria della Rovere's life does not offer solutions. It offers clarity, and clarity, once heard, echoes longer than any dynasty ever could, at some point. Every system expects the story to keep going, to move forward politely, to resolve itself into lessons, to become content. This is the moment we interrupt that expectation, because Victoria della Rovere's life does not end neatly, and it does not consent to being used as proof that things were different back then. That phrase, different times, is the most efficient way history absolves itself. Interruption begins with refusing that comfort. If we allow the story to proceed uninterrupted, it becomes familiar, tragic. yes, but contained. The listener nods, absorbs, and moves on. The system remains intact, validated by the very act of being understood. So the interruption must be deliberate. Victoria was not married because her world lacked empathy. She was married because empathy was subordinate to continuity. That hierarchy did not vanish with crowns. The interruption asks us to pause right here, before metaphor, before moral distance, and name what happened without ceremony. A child was assigned a role that erased her autonomy. Her compliance was rewarded. Her resistance was unthinkable. The system worked exactly as designed. Now interrupt the reflex to excuse it, not by blaming individuals long dead, not by judging a past we cannot change, but by refusing to let structure hide behind inevitability. Every time history says there was no alternative, interruption asks, who decided that? Every time tradition claims this was necessary, interruption asks, necessary for whom? Every time power promises survival, interruption asks, at what cost? And to whom? This is where Victoria's story becomes dangerous. Because once you interrupt the narrative of necessity, you start seeing how often it is rehearsed in the present, how frequently harm is framed as unavoidable, how routinely autonomy is deferred, how consistently sacrifice is demanded from those with the fewest options. Interruption is uncomfortable because it stalls progress. It disrupts flow. It prevents the story from delivering the closure systems rely on to move forward unexamined. Victoria's life was uninterrupted. That is the tragedy. No one stopped the process. No one halted the ceremony. No one questioned the premise loudly enough to matter. So this is where we do it. Not for her, but because of her. The interruption does not claim moral superiority. It claims responsibility. It acknowledges that understanding without refusal is just another form of participation. If we continue the story as usual, it becomes a cautionary tale safely locked in the past. If we interrupt it, it becomes a lens, one that refracts uncomfortably onto the present. The interruption asks you to notice when narratives accelerate toward acceptance, when explanations smooth over harm, when language becomes anesthetic, because that is how systems protect themselves, not by silencing critics, but by absorbing critique into momentum. Victoria's story resists that absorption only if we let it, only if we pause here, mid-thought, and refuse to move on until the question it raises has nowhere to hide. Not how did this happen, but what would stop it from happening again, in any form, anywhere? Interruption is not resolution, it is friction, and friction is the one thing systems cannot endure indefinitely. That is why this act exists, to interrupt the story, so the story can finally interrupt us. Every system depends on one fragile assumption, that people will continue, not because they agree, but because stopping feels impossible. Victoria della Rovere lived in a world where refusal did not exist as an option. The vocabulary was absent. The exits were sealed. To say no was to erase oneself entirely, spiritually, socially, physically. So she did not refuse. She endured. History often confuses endurance with virtue. It praises those who survive inside unjust structures and calls that survival proof of legitimacy. But endurance is not consent, and silence is not agreement. Refusal begins by separating those ideas. Victoria's obedience does not validate the system that demanded it. Her compliance does not absolve the machinery that consumed her childhood. Her later authority does not retroactively justify the terms of her captivity. To refuse this confusion is the first ethical act the story asks of us. Refusal does not mean rewriting the past. It means withholding validation from narratives that frame harm as necessity. It means declining to admire outcomes without interrogating costs. It means rejecting the lie that stability is worth any price. As long as the price is paid quietly. The Medici believed refusal was dangerous. They were right. But not in the way they thought. Refusal is dangerous to systems that rely on inevitability. It interrupts momentum. It exposes choices where none were supposed to exist. It reveals that what was called the only way was often just the most convenient. Refusal is not rebellion with banners. It is not violence. It is not spectacle. It is a line drawn where normalization once flowed, when we refuse to romanticize dynasties that fed on constrained lives. We weaken the myth that greatness excuses harm. When we refuse to call coerced sacrifice tradition, we reclaim language from power. When we refuse to accept endurance as proof of justice, we restore agency to those history flattened into footnotes. Victoria could not refuse. We can. That difference matters. It matters when institutions ask for early compliance in exchange for distant promises. It matters when loyalty is rewarded more than integrity. It matters when harm is rebranded as how things work. Refusal does not guarantee change. History offers no such comfort. But refusal does guarantee something else. Non-participation in the lie that systems are natural, the lie that harm is unavoidable, the lie that survival equals success. Victoria's story reaches its moral clarity here. Not in condemnation of the past, but in the responsibility of the present. To refuse is to remember correctly. To remember correctly is to deny systems the amnesia they require to persist. This is not about judging people who lived without alternatives. It is about recognizing alternatives when they exist and choosing them. The Medici ended because their system could not tolerate refusal. It consumed adaptability in the name of purity and called the result fate. Refusal would not have saved the dynasty, but it might have saved a childhood. That truth lingers. So this is the stance the story takes. Quietly, firmly, without apology. We will not confuse endurance with virtue. We will not call harm necessary because it was organized. We will not admire legacies without counting their costs. We refuse, and in that refusal, the story finally breaks free of the system that tried to absorb it. Every story that truly matters leaves behind a decision. Not for the characters. Their paths are already sealed, but for the listener. Standing in the present with knowledge the past never had. Victoria della Rovere did not get to choose. Her life unfolded along tracks laid before she could see them. The decisions were made upstream, by people who believed they were acting responsibly, faithfully, even lovingly. By the time the consequences arrived, they looked like destiny. But destiny is often just choice made early and protected from challenge. We live in a different world now, not a better one by default, but one with more exits, more language, more visibility. The difference is not that harm has disappeared. The difference is that choice exists where inevitability once ruled. That difference creates responsibility. The choice this story presents is not dramatic. It does not demand heroism. It does not require overthrowing institutions or rejecting history outright. It asks for something quieter and more difficult: attention. To notice when sacrifice is being framed as virtue. To notice when obedience is mistaken for morality. To notice when endurance is praised without asking who benefits from it. Choice begins with naming. Victoria's life teaches us that unnamed harm survives longest. When suffering is described as normal, traditional, or necessary, it becomes invisible and therefore renewable. Naming interrupts that cycle. It pulls harm out of ritual and into daylight, where it can no longer hide behind precedent. Choice also involves memory. Not selective memory that celebrates outcomes, but honest memory that includes cost. Not admiration that flattens complexity, but understanding that holds contradiction without excuse. We can choose to remember the Medici as patrons of art, and also as architects of a system that consumed lives to sustain itself. We can hold both truths without collapsing into cynicism or nostalgia. That is a choice. And finally, choice involves refusal with direction. Refusal alone stops participation. Choice determines what replaces it. What do we build when we refuse to trade autonomy for continuity? What do we protect when legacy is no longer sacred by default? What systems deserve preservation, and which survive only because no one has questioned them loudly enough? Victoria's story does not prescribe answers. It does something more honest. It sharpens the question. Because the most dangerous moment in any society is not collapse. It is continuation without reflection. When things keep working just well enough to avoid scrutiny. When harm remains organized, polite, and profitable. The Medici world ended when its future ran out. Ours will be decided by what we choose to notice before that happens. This is where the story releases you. Not with comfort, not with certainty, but with clarity. You cannot unhear what this story has revealed, that systems outlive their justifications, that endurance can mask depletion, that survival achieved through silence is not success. You can only choose what to do with that clarity, to let the story fade into history, admired and archived, or to carry it forward as a lens, one that asks, again and again, who is paying for what we preserve? Who is being asked to endure so others can continue? And at what point does continuity become complicity? Victoria della Rovere never had a choice. We do, and that is where this story truly ends.